Don Juan had once told me that a man of knowledge had predilections. I asked him to explain his statement. "My predilection is to see," he said. "What do you mean by that?" "I like to see," he said, "because only by seeing can a man of knowledge know." "What kind of things do you see?" "Everything." "But I also see everything, and I'm not a man of knowledge." "No, you don't see. I think I do." "I tell you, you don't." "What makes you say that, Don Juan?" "You only look at the surface of things." "Do you mean that every man of knowledge actually sees through everything he looks at?" "No, that's not what I mean. I said that a man of knowledge has his own predilections. Mine is just to see and to know. Others do other things." "What other things, for example?" "Take Zacatecas. He's a man of knowledge, and his predilection is dancing. So he dances, and knows." "Is the predilection of a man of knowledge something he does in order to know?" "Yes, that's correct." "But how could dancing help Zacatecas to know?" "One can say that Zacatecas dances with all he has." "Does he dance like I dance? I mean, like dancing?" "Let's say that he dances like I see, and not like you may dance." "Does he also see the way you see?" "Yes, but he also dances." "How does Zacatecas dance?" "It's hard to explain that. It's a peculiar way of dancing he does when he wants to know. But all I can say about it is that unless you understand the ways of a man who knows, it's impossible to talk about dancing, or seeing." "Have you seen him doing his dancing?" "Yes. However, it's not possible for everyone who looks at his dancing to see that it is his peculiar way of knowing. I knew Zacatecas, or at least I knew who he was. We had met, and once I had bought him a beer. He was very polite and told me I should feel free to stop at his house any time I wanted to. I toyed for a long time with the idea of visiting him, but I didn't tell Don Juan. On the afternoon of May 14th, 1962, I drove up to Zacatecas' house. He had given me directions how to get there, and I had no trouble finding it. It was on a corner and had a fence all around it. The gate was closed. I walked around it to see if I could peek inside the house. It appeared to be deserted. "Don Elias," I called out loud. The chickens got frightened and scattered about, cackling furiously. A small dog came to the fence. I expected it to bark at me. Instead, it just sat there, looking at me. I called out once again, and the chickens had another burst of cackling. An old woman came out of the house. I asked her to call Don Elias. "He's not here," she said. "Where can I find him?" "He's in the fields." "Where in the fields?" "I don't know. Come back in the late afternoon. He'll be here around 5. "Are you Don Elias's wife?" "Yes, I'm his wife," she said, and smiled. I tried to ask her about Zacatecas, but she excused herself and said that she didn't speak Spanish well. I got into my car and drove away. I returned to the house around 6 o'clock. I drove to the door and yelled Zacatecas' name. This time, he came out of the house. I turned on my tape recorder, which in its brown leather case looked like a camera hanging from my shoulder. He seemed to recognize me. "Oh, it's you," he said, smiling. "How's Juan?" "He's fine, but how are you, Don Elias?" He didn't answer. He seemed to be nervous. Overtly, he was very composed, but I felt that he was ill at ease. "Has Juan sent you here on some sort of errand?" "No, I came here by myself." "What in the world for?" His question seemed to betray very bona fide surprise. "I just wanted to talk to you," I said, hoping to sound as casual as possible. "Don Juan has told me marvelous things about you, and I got curious and wanted to ask you a few questions." Zacatecas was standing in front of me. His body was lean and wiry. He was wearing khaki pants and shirt. His eyes were half closed. He seemed to be sleepy, or perhaps drunk. His mouth was open a bit, and his lower lip hung. I noticed that he was breathing deeply and seemed to be almost snoring. The thought came to me that Zacatecas was undoubtedly plastered out of his mind, but that thought seemed to be very incongruous because only a few minutes before, when he came out of his house, he had been very alert and aware of my presence. "What do you want to talk about?" he finally said. His voice was tired. It was as though his words dragged after each other. I felt very uneasy. It was as if his tiredness was contagious and pulling me. "Nothing in particular," I answered. "I just came to chat with you in a friendly way. You once asked me to come to your house." "Yes, I did, but it's not the same now." "Why isn't it the same?" "Don't you talk with Juan?" "Yes, I do." "Then what do you want with me?" "I thought maybe I could ask you some questions." "Ask Juan. Isn't he teaching you?" "He is, but just the same, I'd like to ask you about what he is teaching me and have your opinion. This way I'll be able to know what to do." "Why do you want to do that? Don't you trust Juan?" "I do." "Then why don't you ask him to tell you what you want to know?" "I do, and he tells me, but if you could also tell me about what Don Juan is teaching me, perhaps I'll understand better." "Juan can tell you everything. He alone can do that. Don't you understand that?" "I do, but then I'd like to talk with people like you, Don Elias. One doesn't find a man of knowledge every day." "Juan is a man of knowledge." "I know that." "Then why are you talking to me?" "I said I came to be friends." "No, you didn't. There's something else about you this time." I wanted to explain myself, and all I could do was mumble incoherently. Zacatecas didn't say anything. He seemed to listen attentively. His eyes were half closed again, but I felt he was peering at me. He nodded almost imperceptibly. Then his lids opened, and I saw his eyes. He seemed to be looking past me. He casually tapped the floor with the tip of his right foot, just behind his left heel. His legs were slightly arched. His arms were limp against his sides. Then he lifted his right arm. His hand was open, with the palm turned perpendicular to the ground. His fingers were extended and pointing toward me. He let his hand wobble a couple of times before he brought it to my face level. He held it in that position for an instant, and then he said a few words to me. His voice was very clear, yet the words dragged. After a moment, he dropped his hand to his side and remained motionless, taking a strange position. He was standing, resting on the ball of his left foot. His right foot was crossed behind the heel of the left foot, and he was tapping the floor rhythmically and gently with the tip of his right foot. I felt an unwarranted apprehension, a form of restlessness. My thoughts seemed to be dissociated. I was thinking unrelated, nonsensical thoughts that had nothing to do with what was going on. I noticed my discomfort and tried to steer my thoughts back to the situation at hand. But I couldn't, in spite of a great struggle. It was as if some force was keeping me from concentrating or thinking relevant thoughts. Zacatecas had not said a word, and I didn't know what else to say or do. Quite automatically, I turned around and left. Later on, I felt compelled to tell Don Juan about my encounter with Zacatecas. Don Juan roared with laughter. "What really took place there?" I asked. "Zacatecas danced," Don Juan said. "He saw you, then he danced." "What did he do to me?" I felt very cold and dizzy. "He apparently didn't like you, and stopped you by tossing a word at you." "How could he possibly do that?" I exclaimed incredulously. "Very simple. He stopped you with his will." "What did you say?" "He stopped you with his will." The explanation didn't suffice. His statements sounded like gibberish to me. I tried to probe him further, but he couldn't explain the event to my satisfaction. Obviously, that event, or any event that occurred within this alien system of sensible interpretation, could be explained or understood only in terms of the units of meaning proper to that system. This work is, therefore, a reportage, and should be read as a reportage. The system I recorded was incomprehensible to me. Thus, the pretense to anything other than reporting about it would be misleading and impertinent. In this respect, I've adopted the phenomenological method and have striven to deal with sorcery solely as phenomena that were presented to me. I, as the perceiver, recorded what I perceived, and at the moment of recording, I endeavored to suspend judgment.
Friday, July 6, 1962. Don Juan and I started on a trip late in the afternoon of Saturday, June 23rd. He said we were going to look for honguitos, the mushrooms, in the state of Chihuahua. He said it was going to be a long, hard trip. He was right. We arrived in a little mining town in northern Chihuahua at 10 p.m. on Wednesday, June 27th. We walked from the place I had parked the car at the outskirts of town to the house of his friends, a Tarahumara Indian and his wife. We slept there. The next morning, the man woke us up around 5. He brought us gruel and beans. He sat and talked to Don Juan while we ate, but he said nothing concerning our trip. After breakfast, the man put water into my canteen and 2 sweet rolls into my knapsack. Don Juan handed me the canteen, fixed the knapsack with a cord over his shoulders, thanked the man for his courtesies, and turning to me, said, "It is time to go." We walked on the dirt road for about a mile. From there, we cut through the fields, and in 2 hours, we were at the foot of the hills south of town. We climbed the gentle slopes in a southwesterly direction. When we reached the steeper inclines, Don Juan changed directions, and we followed a high valley to the east. Despite his advanced age, Don Juan kept up a pace so incredibly fast that by midday I was completely exhausted. We sat down, and he opened the bread sack. "You can eat all of it if you want," he said. "How about you?" "I'm not hungry, and we won't need this food later on." I was very tired and hungry and took him up on his offer. I felt this was a good time to talk about the purpose of our trip, and quite casually I asked, "Do you think we're going to stay here for a long time?" "We are here to gather some mezcalito. We will stay until tomorrow." "Where is mezcalito?" "All around us." Cacti of many species were growing in profusion all through the area, but I couldn't distinguish peyote among them. We started to hike again, and by 3 o'clock we came to a long, narrow valley with steep side hills. I felt strangely excited at the idea of finding peyote, which I had never seen in its natural environment. We entered the valley and must have walked about 400 feet when suddenly I spotted 3 unmistakable peyote plants. They were in a cluster a few inches above the ground in front of me, to the left of the path. They looked like round, pulpy, green roses. I ran toward them, pointing them out to Don Juan. He ignored me and deliberately kept his back turned as he walked away. I knew I had done the wrong thing, and for the rest of the afternoon we walked in silence, moving slowly on the flat valley floor, which was covered with small, sharp-edged rocks. We moved among the cacti, disturbing crowds of lizards, and at times a solitary bird, and I passed scores of peyote plants without saying a word. At 6 o'clock, we were at the bottom of the mountains that marked the end of the valley. We climbed to a ledge. Don Juan dropped his sack and sat down. I was hungry again, but we had no food left. I suggested that we pick up the mezcalito and head back for town. He looked annoyed and made a smacking sound with his lips. He said we were going to spend the night there. We sat quietly. There was a rock wall to the left, and to the right was the valley we had just crossed. It extended for quite a distance, and seemed to be wider than, and not so flat as I had thought. Viewed from the spot where I sat, it was full of small hills and protuberances. "Tomorrow we will start walking back," Don Juan said, without looking at me, and pointing to the valley. "We will work our way back and pick him as we cross the field. That is, we will pick him only when he is in our way. He will find us, and not the other way around. He will find us, if he wants to." Don Juan rested his back against the rock wall and, with his head turned to his side, continued talking as though another person were there besides myself. One more thing. Only I can pick him. You will perhaps carry the bag or walk ahead of me, I don't know yet. But tomorrow you will not point at him as you did today. I'm sorry, Don Juan. It's all right. You didn't know. Did your benefactor teach you all this about Mescalito? No. Nobody's taught me about him. It was the protector himself who was my teacher. Then Mescalito is like a person to whom you can talk? No, he isn't. How does he teach, then? He remained silent for a while. Remember the time when you played with him? You understood what he meant, didn't you? I did. That's the way he teaches. You didn't know it then, but if you'd paid attention to him, he would have talked to you. When? When you saw him for the first time. He seemed to be very annoyed by my questioning. I told him I had to ask all these questions because I wanted to find out all I could. Don't ask me, he smiled maliciously. Ask him. The next time you see him, ask him everything you want to know. Then Mescalito is like a person you can talk. He didn't let me finish. He turned away, picked up the canteen, stepped down from the ledge, and disappeared around the rock. I didn't want to be alone there, and even though he hadn't asked me to go along, I followed him. We walked for about 500 feet to a small creek. He washed his hands and face and filled up the canteen. He swished water around in his mouth, but didn't drink it. I scooped up some water in my hands and drank, but he stopped me and said it was unnecessary to drink. He handed me the canteen and started to walk back to the ledge. When we got there, we sat again, facing the valley with our backs to the rock wall. I asked if we could build a fire. He reacted as if it was inconceivable to ask such a thing. He said that for that night, we were Mescalito's guests, and he was going to keep us warm. It was already dusk. Don Juan pulled 2 thin cotton blankets from his sack, threw one onto my lap, and sat cross-legged with the other one over his shoulders. Below us, the valley was dark, with its edges already diffused in the evening mist. Don Juan sat motionless, facing the peyote field. A steady wind blew on my face. The twilight is the crack between the worlds, he said softly, without turning to me. I didn't ask what he meant. My eyes became tired. Suddenly, I felt elated. I had a strange, overpowering desire to weep. I lay on my stomach. The rock floor was hard and uncomfortable, and I had to change my position every few minutes. Finally, I sat up and crossed my legs, putting the blanket over my shoulders. To my amazement, this position was supremely comfortable, and I fell asleep. When I woke up, I heard Don Juan talking to me. It was very dark. I couldn't see him well. I didn't understand what he said, but I followed him when he started to go down from the ledge. We moved carefully, or at least I did, because of the darkness. We stopped at the bottom of the rock wall. Don Juan sat down and signaled me to sit at his left. He opened up his shirt and took out a leather sack, which he opened and placed on the ground in front of him. It contained a number of dried peyote buttons. After a long pause, he picked up one of the buttons. He held it in his right hand, rubbing it several times between the thumb and the first finger, as he chanted softly. Suddenly, he let out a tremendous cry. Aye! It was weird, unexpected. It terrified me. Vaguely, I saw him place the peyote button in his mouth and begin to chew it. After a moment, he picked up the whole sack, leaned toward me, and told me in a whisper to take the sack, pick out one mescalito, put the sack in front of us again, and then do exactly as he did. I picked a peyote button and rubbed it as he had done. Meanwhile, he chanted, swaying back and forth. I tried to put the button into my mouth several times, but I felt embarrassed to cry out. Then, as in a dream, an unbelievable shriek came out of me. Ahuyi! For a moment, I thought it was someone else. Again, I felt the effects of nervous shock in my stomach. I was falling backward. I was fainting. I put the peyote button into my mouth and chewed it. After a while, Don Juan picked up another from the sack. I was relieved to see that he put it into his mouth after a short chant. He passed the sack to me, and I placed it in front of us again after taking one button. This cycle went on 5 times before I noticed any thirst. I picked up the canteen to drink, but Don Juan told me just to wash my mouth and not to drink, or I would vomit. I swished the water around in my mouth repeatedly. At a certain moment, drinking was a formidable temptation, and I swallowed a bit of water. Immediately, my stomach began to convulse. I expected to have a painless and effortless flowing of liquid from my mouth, as had happened during my first experience with peyote. But to my surprise, I had only the ordinary sensation of vomiting. It didn't last long, however. Don Juan picked up another button and handed me the sack, and the cycle was renewed and repeated until I had chewed 14 buttons. By this time, all my early sensations of thirst, cold, and discomfort had disappeared. In their place, I felt an unfamiliar sense of warmth and excitation. I took the canteen to freshen my mouth, but it was empty. "Can we go to the creek, Don Juan?" The sound of my voice didn't project out, but hit the roof of my palate, bounced back into my throat, and echoed to and fro between them. The echo was soft and musical, and seemed to have wings that flapped inside my throat. Its touch soothed me. I followed its back-and-forth movements until it had vanished. I repeated the question. My voice sounded as though I was talking inside a vault. Don Juan didn't answer. I got up and turned in the direction of the creek. I looked at him to see if he was coming, but he seemed to be listening attentively to something. He made an imperative sign with his hand to be quiet. "Abutol is already here," he said. I had never heard that word before, and I was wondering whether to ask him about it, when I detected a noise that seemed to be a buzzing inside my ears. The sound became louder by degrees until it was like the vibration caused by an enormous bull roarer. It lasted for a brief moment and subsided gradually until everything was quiet again. The violence and the intensity of the noise terrified me. I was shaking so much that I could hardly remain standing, yet I was perfectly rational. If I had been drowsy a few minutes before, this feeling had totally vanished, giving way to a state of extreme lucidity. The noise reminded me of a science fiction movie in which a gigantic bee buzzed its wings coming out of an atomic radiation area. I laughed at the thought. I saw Don Juan slumping back into his relaxed position, and suddenly the image of a gigantic bee accosted me again. It was more real than ordinary thoughts. It stood alone, surrounded by an extraordinary clarity. Everything else was driven from my mind. This state of mental clearness, which had no precedence in my life, produced another moment of terror. I began to perspire. I leaned toward Don Juan to tell him I was afraid. His face was a few inches from mine. He was looking at me, but his eyes were the eyes of a bee. They looked like round glasses that had a light of their own in the darkness. His lips were pushed out, and from them came a pattering noise. Pitta, pitta, pitta. I jumped backward, nearly crashing into the rock wall. For a seemingly endless time, I experienced an unbearable fear. I was panting and whining. The perspiration had frozen on my skin, giving me an awkward rigidity. Then I heard Don Juan's voice saying, "Get up, move around, get up." The image vanished, and again I could see his familiar face. "I'll get some water," I said after another endless moment. My voice cracked. I could hardly articulate the words. Don Juan nodded yes. As I walked away, I realized that my fear had gone as fast and as mysteriously as it had come. Upon approaching the creek, I noticed that I could see every object in the way. I remembered I had just seen Don Juan clearly, whereas earlier I could hardly distinguish the outlines of his figure. I stopped and looked into the distance, and I could even see across the valley. Some boulders on the other side became perfectly visible. I thought it must be early morning, but it occurred to me that I might have lost track of time. I looked at my watch. It was 10 of 12. I checked the watch to see if it was working. It couldn't be midday. It had to be midnight. I intended to make a dash for the water and come back to the rocks, but I saw Don Juan coming down and I waited for him. I told him I could see in the dark. He stared at me for a long time without saying a word. If he did speak, perhaps I didn't hear him, for I was concentrating on my new, unique ability to see in the dark. I could distinguish the very minute pebbles in the sand. At moments, everything was so clear, it seemed to be early morning or dusk. Then it would get dark. Then it would clear again. Soon, I realized that the brightness corresponded to my heart's diastole, and the darkness to its systole. The world changed from bright to dark to bright again, with every beat of my heart. I was absorbed in this discovery when the same strange sound that I had heard before became audible again. My muscles stiffened. Anuctal, as I heard the word this time, is here, Don Juan said. I fancied the roar so thunderous, so overwhelming that nothing else mattered. When it had subsided, I perceived a sudden increase in the volume of water. The creek, which a minute before had been less than a foot wide, expanded until it was an enormous lake. Light that seemed to come from above it touched the surface as though shining through thick foliage. From time to time, the water would glitter for a second, gold and black. Then it would remain dark, lightless, almost out of sight, and yet strangely present. I don't recall how long I stayed there, just watching, squatting on the shore of the Black Lake. The roar must have subsided in the meantime, because what jolted me back to reality was again a terrifying buzzing. I turned around to look for Don Juan. I saw him climbing up and disappearing behind the rock ledge. Yet the feeling of being alone didn't bother me at all. I squatted there in a state of absolute confidence and abandonment. The roar again became audible. It was very intense, like the noise made by a high wind. Listening to it as carefully as I could, I was able to detect a definite melody. It was a composite of high-pitched sounds, like human voices, accompanied by a deep bass drum. I focused all my attention on the melody, that the systole and diastole of my heart coincided with the sound of the bass drum and with the pattern of the music. I stood up, and the melody stopped. I tried to listen to my heartbeat, but it wasn't detectable. I squatted again, thinking that perhaps the position of my body had caused or induced the sounds, but nothing happened. Not a sound, not even my heart. I thought I had had enough, but as I stood up to leave, I felt a tremor of the earth. The ground under my feet was shaking. I was losing my balance. I fell backward and remained on my back while the earth shook violently. I tried to grab a rock or a plant, but something was sliding under me. I jumped up, stood for a moment, and fell down again. The ground on which I sat was moving, sliding into the water like a raft. I remained motionless, stunned by a terror that was, like everything else, unique, uninterrupted, and absolute. I moved through the water of the Black Lake, perched on a piece of soil that looked like an earthen log. I had the feeling I was going in a southerly direction, transported by the current. I could see the water moving and swirling around. It felt cold and oddly heavy to the touch. I fancied it alive. There were no distinguishable shores or landmarks, and I can't recall the thoughts or the feelings that must have come to me during this trip. After what seemed like hours of drifting, my raft made a right-angle turn to the left, the east. It continued to slide on the water for a very short distance and unexpectedly rammed against something. The impact threw me forward. I closed my eyes and felt a sharp pain as my knees and my outstretched arms hit the ground. After a moment, I looked up. I was lying on the dirt. It was as though my earthen log had merged with the land. I sat up and turned around. The water was receding. It moved backward like a wave in reverse until it disappeared. I sat there for a long time, trying to collect my thoughts and resolve all that had happened into a coherent unit. My entire body ached. My throat felt like an open sore. I had bitten my lips when I landed. I stood up. The wind made me realize I was cold. My clothes were wet. My hands and jaws and knees shook so violently that I had to lie down again. Drops of perspiration slid into my eyes and burned them until I yelled with pain. After a while, I regained a measure of stability and stood up. In the dark twilight, the scene was very clear. I took a couple of steps. A distinct sound of many human voices came to me. They seemed to be talking loudly. I followed the sound. I walked for about 50 yards and came to a sudden stop. I had reached a dead end. The place where I stood was a corral formed by enormous boulders. I could distinguish another row, and then another, and another, until they merged into the sheer mountain. From among them came the most exquisite music. It was a fluid, uninterrupted, eerie flow of sounds. At the foot of one boulder, I saw a man sitting on the ground, his face turned almost in profile. I approached him until I was perhaps 10 feet away. Then he turned his head and looked at me. I stopped. His eyes were the water I had just seen. They had the same enormous volume, the sparkling of gold and black. His head was pointed like a strawberry. His skin was green, dotted with innumerable warts. Except for the pointed shape, his head was exactly like the surface of the peyote plant. I stood in front of him, staring. I couldn't take my eyes away from him. I felt he was deliberately pressing on my chest with the weight of his eyes. I was choking. I lost my balance and fell to the ground. His eyes turned away. I heard him talking to me. At first, his voice was like the soft rustle of a light breeze. Then I heard it as music, as a melody of voices, and I knew it was saying, "What do you want?" I knelt before him and talked about my life, then wept. He looked at me again. I felt his eyes pulling me away, and I thought that moment would be the moment of my death. He signaled me to come closer. I vacillated for an instant before I took a step forward. As I came closer, he turned his eyes away from me and showed me the back of his hand. The melody said, "Look." There was a round hole in the middle of his hand. "Look," said the melody again. I looked into the hole, and I saw myself. I was very old and feeble, and was running stooped over, with bright sparks flying all around me. Then 3 of the sparks hit me, 2 in the head and 1 in the left shoulder. My figure in the hole stood up for a moment until it was fully vertical, and then disappeared together with the hole. Mescalito turned his eyes to me again. They were so close to me that I heard them rumble softly with that peculiar sound I had heard many times that night. They became peaceful by degrees until they were like a quiet pond rippled by gold and black flashes. He turned his eyes away once more and hopped like a cricket for perhaps 50 yards. He hopped again and again and was gone. The next thing I remember is that I began to walk. Very rationally, I tried to recognize landmarks, such as mountains in the distance, in order to orient myself. I had been obsessed by cardinal points throughout the whole experience, and I believed that north had to be to my left. I walked in that direction for quite a while before I realized that it was daytime and that I was no longer using my night vision. I remembered I had a watch and looked at the time. It was 8 o'clock. It was about 10 o'clock when I got to the ledge where I'd been the night before. Don Juan was lying on the ground, asleep. "Where have you been?" he asked. I sat down to catch my breath. After a long silence, he asked, "Did you see him?" I began to narrate to him the sequence of my experiences from the beginning, but he interrupted me, saying that all that mattered was whether I had seen him or not. He asked how close to me Mescalito was. I told him I had nearly touched him. That part of my story interested him. He listened attentively to every detail without comment, interrupting only to ask questions about the form of the entity I had seen, its disposition, and other details about it. It was about noon when Don Juan seemed to have had enough of my story. He stood up and strapped a canvas bag to my chest. He told me to walk behind him and said he was going to cut Mescalito loose, and I had to receive him in my hands and place him inside the bag gently. We drank some water and started to walk. When we reached the edge of the valley, he seemed to hesitate for a moment before deciding which direction to take. Once he had made his choice, we walked in a straight line. Every time we came to a peyote plant, he squatted in front of it and very gently cut off the top with his short, serrated knife. He made an incision level with the ground and sprinkled the wound, as he called it, with pure sulfur powder, which he carried in a leather sack. He held the fresh button in his left hand and spread the powder with his right hand. Then he stood up and handed me the button, which I received with both hands as he had prescribed, and placed inside the bag. "Stand erect, and don't let the bag touch the ground or the bushes or anything else," he said repeatedly, as though he thought I would forget. We collected 65 buttons. When the bag was completely filled, he put it on my back and strapped a new one to my chest. By the time we had crossed the plateau, we had 2 full sacks containing 110 peyote buttons. The bags were so heavy and bulky that I could hardly walk under their weight and volume. Don Juan whispered to me that the bags were heavy because Mescalito wanted to return to the ground. He said it was the sadness of leaving his abode which made Mescalito heavy. My real chore was not to let the bags touch the ground, because if I did, Mescalito would never allow me to take him again. At one particular moment, the pressure of the straps on my shoulders became unbearable. Something was exerting tremendous force in order to pull me down. I felt very apprehensive. I noticed that I had started to walk faster, almost at a run. I was, in a way, trotting behind Don Juan. Suddenly, the weight on my back and chest diminished. The load became spongy and light. I ran freely to catch up with Don Juan, who was ahead of me. I told him I didn't feel the weight any longer. He explained that we had already left Mescalito's abode. Tuesday, July 3rd, 1962. I think Mescalito has almost accepted you, Don Juan said. Why do you say he's almost accepted me, Don Juan? He didn't kill you, or even harm you. He gave you a good fright, but not a really bad one. If he had not accepted you at all, he would have appeared to you as monstrous and full of wrath. Some people have learned the meaning of horror upon encountering him and not being accepted by him. If he's so terrible, why didn't you tell me about it before you took me to the field? You don't have the courage to seek him deliberately. I thought it would be better if you didn't know. But I might have died, Don Juan. Yes, you might have. But I was certain it was going to be all right for you. He played with you once. He didn't harm you. I thought he would also have compassion for you this time. I asked him if he really thought Mescalito had had compassion for me. The experience had been terrifying. I felt that I'd nearly died of fright. He said Mescalito had been most kind to me. He had showed me a scene that was an answer to a question. Don Juan said Mescalito had given me a lesson. I asked him what the lesson was and what it meant. He said it would be impossible to answer that question because I had been too afraid to know exactly what I had asked Mescalito. Don Juan probed my memory as to what I had said to Mescalito before he showed me the scene on his hand, but I couldn't remember. All I remembered was my falling on my knees and confessing my sins to him. Don Juan seemed uninterested in talking about it anymore. I asked him, "Can you teach me the words to the songs you chanted?" "No, I can't. Those words are my own. The words the Protector himself taught me. The songs are my songs. I can't tell you what they are." "Why can't you tell me, Don Juan?" "Because these songs are a link between the Protector and myself. I'm sure someday he will teach you your own songs. Wait until then, and never, absolutely never, copy or ask about the songs that belong to another man." "What was the name you called out? Can you tell me that, Don Juan?" "No. His name can never be voiced, except to call him." "What if I want to call him myself?" "If someday he accepts you, he will tell you his name. That name will be for you alone to use, either to call him loudly or to say quietly to yourself. Perhaps he will tell you his name is José. Who knows?" "Why is it wrong to use his name when talking about him?" "You've seen his eyes, haven't you? You can't fool around with the Protector. That's why I can't get over the fact that he chose to play with you." "How can he be a protector when he hurts some people?" The answer is very simple. Mescalito is a protector because he's available to anyone who seeks him. But isn't it true that everything in the world is available to anyone who seeks it? No, that's not true. The ally powers are available only to the brujos, but anyone can partake of Mescalito. But why then does he hurt some people? Not everybody likes Mescalito, yet they all seek him with the idea of profiting without doing any work. Naturally, their encounter with him is always horrifying. What happens when he accepts a man completely? He appears to him as a man or as a light. When a man has won this kind of acceptance, Mescalito is constant. He never changes after that. Perhaps when you meet him again, he will be a light, and someday he may even take you flying and reveal all his secrets to you. What do I have to do to arrive at that point, Don Juan? You have to be a strong man, and your life has to be truthful. What is a truthful life? A life lived with deliberateness. A good, strong life.